welcome back to the Classics Capsule with me, Sean McKearnon, and today I'm going to be looking at the films of one particular filmmaker. Not the most serious of films, it has to be said. The filmmaker in question was born Melvin Kaminsky in 1928. He's known to the world as Mel Brooks. Well, Mel Brooks actually started off as a writer for American television programs, the most famous ones being a variety show called Your Show of Shows. And he went on from that to co-create a situation comedy called Get Smart, which ran from 1965 to 1970. In between times, he made a number of films which have gone into cinema folklore, either because they are so hysterically funny or they are so unutterably awful, it's untrue. Now, the first film he made eventually became known as The Producers, and that was produced while Get Smart was still in production in 1967. But it had a very, very troubled life. When Mel Brooks wrote the screenplay for the thing, he actually called it after the play that is produced during the course of the film, and the film was called Springtime for Hitler. And all of the major studios passed on the film because there was absolutely no way they were going to make a film about Hitler when the Second World War had only ended just over 20 years previously, and it was still a very, very sensitive subject. They didn't get the joke of the fact that a Jewish filmmaker wanted to make a film parodying Hitler and the entire Nazi regime. He wouldn't even read the treatment for it. It was just he saw the title and said no. One of the studios said that they'd be prepared to go ahead with the film provided he changed the title to Springtime for Mussolini, which is just so absurd. It's actually very nearly as absurd as the actual film itself and what goes on in the film, but Brooks very wisely told the major studios where to go, and he went ahead himself to finance the film and find a cast for it, during which he met a young actor in a play named Gene Wilder. And the really sad thing about the play was it was actually a drama that Gene Wilder was in, but every time he opened his mouth or did something on stage which was supposed to be dramatic, the audience thought it was absolutely uproariously funny what he was doing, and he couldn't understand why. And Mel Brooks pointed out to him after the show, he went backstage to meet him, and he said to him, "You are naturally very, very funny. You can't help it. Everything you do is funny." And he then went on to tell him about this film that he was making, and said to him, "When I've got everything in place, I will come back for you because I want you to be in this film." 2 years later, we get to 1967, and Mel Brooks has got a producer, he's got the money, and he's got a film studio prepared to do it, provided he does change the title of the film, because none of the distribution companies would look at it because it was called Springtime for Hitler. So Mel Brooks then went away, looked at it, and then decided to call it The Producers, which again is a joke because, as he says himself, the two people who produced the play are anything but producers. They're an absolute disaster in what they actually want to do. So there's a joke in the title as well. He then went away and managed to persuade an actor named Zero Mostel to take the lead role. Zero Mostel was not very keen on doing this at all. Just over 2 years previously to it, he'd had an accident where he'd been run over and dragged along the street by a bus and had injured his leg quite severely. And as a result of that, he forced Mel Brooks to agree to him not working later than 5 o'clock each evening, and any time his leg started to hurt, he had to stop. Mel Brooks was absolutely desperate to get Zero Mostel, so he agreed to it, not actually realising the problems that this would cause him, because he had a very, very small budget. He only had $900,000 to make this film. But he eventually managed to persuade Zero Mostel that yes, he would be the absolute perfect choice for the main character in this, a character named Max Bialystock, who had been a very successful Broadway producer but had then ended up producing a string of flops. He is visited one day by a neurotic accountant named Leo Bloom. And the original choice for Leo Bloom was Peter Sellers. And Peter Sellers was actually cast as Leo Bloom and then just seemed to disappear off the face of the earth and nobody could contact him, so he was dropped from the film. Gene Wilder, in the meantime, had gone on to have a bit of a success in his first film when he appeared in Bonnie and Clyde, and he'd then gone back to appearing in theatre. And one night, at the end of a play, there's a knock on his dressing room door, and when he opened it, Mel Brooks was stood there with the script for the producers, and he said, "See, I remembered, here's the script, you are Leo Bloom." And so he had his two major stars, one very major star and one relative unknown who really steals the thing in his performance. The script and the story features what can only be described as a totally deranged, off-the-wall Nazi supporter named Franz Liebkind. The original choice for Franz Liebkind was a then young and unknown actor named Dustin Hoffman. And Hoffman read the script and he absolutely loved it. And then the day before they were due to start filming, he got a phone call asking him to fly across America for an audition the next day for a film that was just being put together called The Graduate. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, he went to Mel Brooks' apartment and woke him up and said to him, "You've got to let me go and audition for this because it's a much bigger film." And Mel Brooks only agreed to him going to do the audition because he thought Dustin Hoffman had absolutely no chance of getting the part in The Graduate. So he was very, very shocked at 6 o'clock the next evening when he got a phone call from Dustin Hoffman on the other side of America saying, "I'm not coming back, I've got this part, I'm making The Graduate rather than the producers." Which then gave a little bit of a problem. But the next morning, Mel Brooks saw an actor named Kenneth Mars, originally for the part of the director of this monstrosity of a play. And Kenneth Mars, when he was told about the story, immediately became far more interested in the character of Franz Liebkind and decided he'd much rather play Franz Liebkind. And when he started to read the thing, he put on this completely fake comedic German accent, which Mel Brooks fell in love with straight away and cast him on the spot. Which then gave him the problem that he had nobody for the director. But he was put onto an American English actor named Christopher Hewitt, who, as soon as he walked in, he read 2 lines of the script and Mel Brooks decided there and then he was perfect for the character Roger Debris. The next problem that they had was who to cast as the totally inept actor who was going to play Hitler in this complete monstrosity of a play. And they came across a very strange performer named Dick Shawn, who plays a sort of beatnik hippie who's completely off the wall, and his character basically sums it up. His character's name is Lorenzo Saint Dubois, known by his initials of LSD. And the minute he walks on, you know that there's just something completely offbeat about his performance. His costume consists of a tin of soup worn around his neck as a medallion. And in the thing, he's walked into the wrong theatre to audition for completely the wrong play. But because he is completely wrong, he's cast as Adolf Hitler. The basis of the play is that Max Bialystock and Leo Bloom are going to produce the worst play ever written to close on its first night, but it's going to be overcommitted in terms of backers, so that when it closes on the first night, they don't have to pay any profits or any proceeds out. They get to keep all the money, so they become millionaires overnight for producing a flop. The only problem is, of course, that it turns out not to be a flop because the audience who go to see this play, called Springtime for Hitler, written by Franz Liebkins, which is basically a love letter to Adolf Hitler, they get completely the wrong idea and they think it is a spoof. And so the thing becomes a massive hit. The big tragedy of the film is you only see a very small amount of this play, because what you do see of it, and it gets turned into a musical by Roger Debris, and the title song is the biggest part of it you see. It's 4 minutes of the worst taste humour you can imagine, of a song called Springtime for Hitler. And there's just all kinds of completely ridiculous lines in it. Like Mel Brooks actually dubs a line in it of "Don't be stupid, be a smarty, come and join the Nazi party." And it then launches into a dance routine where you get this absurd spoof of the old Busby Berkeley musicals from the sort of Hollywood heyday, as they call it, where you always used to see an overhead shot of these intricate dance routines. And Mel Brooks, being Mel Brooks, has an intricate dance routine of a group of people dressed head to foot in black. So you only see the top of their heads goose-stepping round in a very tight circle in the shape of a swastika. At the end of this song, you get a shot of the audience who are all sat with their jaws on the floor at how unutterably bad taste this is. And you don't realise it, but you are actually sat there with the exact same expression on your own face, because how anyone could think you'd even think about getting away with something like this is anyone's guess. The film itself at the time was a bit of a flop in the box office. It didn't cost a lot of money to make, but it didn't take an awful lot in. But since its release, it has developed a major cult following, and it is now considered to be a real classic of satire. It's unusual for a Mel Brooks film, and it actually exists more or less in the real world rather than this weird fantasy creation of a world that he liked to create in his films. The film itself actually won an Academy Award for Best Screenplay, and Gene Wilder was nominated for an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, which, considering it was his first real big starring role, is absolutely incredible. On Mel Brooks then, nothing was really heard from him for 2 or 3 years, and in 1970 he went on to produce and direct a film called The 12 Chairs, which, again, it's a little unusual for him because it's actually an adaptation of a Russian story, a Russian novel. And the story that Mel Brooks tells, being Mel Brooks, the actual novel is actually a very serious story. Mel Brooks turns it into a satire on communism. And he actually gets together a very, very good cast for it. He casts Frank Langella, and Dom DeLuise makes his debut in Mel Brooks films. He went on to be one of the main stalwarts of the things. The main star of it was very, very well known from the musical version of Oliver. He was one of the best Fagans ever committed to screen, Ron Moody. Fresh, strangely enough, from turning down the opportunity of being the third Doctor Who, he turned that down and went and made this film instead. A decision which he said up until the day he died was one of the biggest mistakes of his entire career. He should have done Doctor Who instead. But Ron Moody plays an impoverished Russian aristocrat named Ippolit Vorobyaninov, who has it revealed to him by his mother-in-law on her deathbed that his family had hidden a fortune from the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution in one of the cushions of the dining room chairs, the set of 12 chairs. The only problem was that the 12 chairs had all been sold as individual items, And the story is basically about Ippolit Bayanov, I can't say that name, going round Russia trying to find these chairs to reclaim his family fortune. During the course of his journey, he meets Frank Langella's character named Ostap Bendor, who is a con man, and trying to outdo Dom DeLuise's character, who is Father Fyodor, who is the priest who comes to administer the last rites to his mother-in-law. He hears this tale about the family fortune and immediately abandons the cloth to take up a life of crime to become rich himself. He ends up being left dangling off a cliff top, screaming for help, and the two main characters leave him there. It's probably the least immediate of all of Mel Brooks's films, and the biggest laugh actually comes right at the very end when the very last chair that they track down has to be the one that contains the jewels. The only problem is it's in a museum called the Palace of Culture. So they break into the place the next evening and very carefully cut open the cushion of the chair, and it's empty. And a night watchman catches them, and when they ask where is the jewels, it turns out that the chair had been damaged about 20 years previously. And when it was being repaired and restored, the jewels had been found and had been used to pay for the museum building to house the chair. So the whole adventure had basically just been for absolutely nothing whatsoever. Again, after that film, Mel Brooks disappeared. The 12 Chairs, again, wasn't that well received in the box office, and he disappeared again for a couple of years. But then in 1974, he hit the jackpot with two absolute classic films. The first one is a bit of a scattergun approach in its targets. It lampoons westerns, it lampoons filmmaking and Hollywood in general. It touches on blaxploitation, and it is called Blazing Saddles. And the upshot, the basic story is that this western town needs a new sheriff, and due to an administrative mix-up, they get a black sheriff. And it does go all over the place, and while it's supposed to be set in western times, the climax of it is actually set outside of Hollywood, on Hollywood Boulevard, with people racing up and down on horses, shooting one another, all in western costumes and whatever else. It's just totally ridiculous and typical Mel Brooks. Later on the same year, he produced a film that had actually been taken to him by Gene Wilder as a 3-page story treatment, and between the two of them they wrote the script for a spoof on the old classic black and white horror films, and on one particular type of horror film in particular, and the film was Young Frankenstein. And in Young Frankenstein, Gene Wilder plays the grandson of the infamous Victor Frankenstein, named Frederick Frankenstein. The only problem is that because Victor Frankenstein was the black sheep of the family and was clinically deranged, to distance himself from that, because Frederick Frankenstein is a brilliant surgeon in his own right, he calls himself Frederick Frankenstein, which leads to a running joke when he's approached by the lawyer of his great-great-grandfather who has just died to tell him that he has inherited the family estate in Transylvania. And when he arrives, he meets the stereotypical deformed manservant Igor, absolutely wonderfully played by Marty Feldman, who, when he is introduced to Frederick Frankenstein, immediately, rather than have his name pronounced as Igor, insists that his name is Igor, and insists on calling Gene Wilder's character Froderick, which then leads to the joke right the way through the film. And any time they see each other, they greet each other with Froderick, Igor. Frederick Frankenstein is led to his great-grandfather's notes and research and realises that it is actually possible to reanimate a dead body, so he decides he's going to restart his grandfather's works. And they steal a body, and Marty Feldman's character is then sent to the brain depository to steal the brain of a genius to put into this body. The one that they steal is an executed murderer. Unfortunately, when Igor goes to steal this brain, he is startled by his reflection and a flash of lightning and drops it, so he steals another brain, which he later describes as belonging to somebody named Abby Normal. The label on the brain is, "Do not use this brain, it is abnormal." Kenneth Mars returns to the fold, playing the chief of police with a German accent, this time so thick that not even the local villagers can understand a word he says. His character has a false arm, which is used for a number of things, like lighting a cigarette, and also as a battering ram towards the end of the film when they break into Castle Frankenstein. Peter Boyle as the monster he actually gives a very interesting performance. He generates a huge amount of sympathy for the creature, and he came up with a number of things himself. So it's like the monster is calmed by violin music, and each time he hears the violin music, rather than just sit there with a calm look on his face, he started acting like he was trying to catch butterflies. It's something he did completely off his own bat without any direction whatsoever, but he thought it'd be quite a nice touch. Mel Brooks quite liked the idea of this huge brute actually having this real gentle side, so it was kept in the film. Both of the films, both Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, were massive, massive box office hits. And it gave Mel Brooks a huge amount of leverage to make his next film, which it was a satire on not only the silent movie era, but on filmmaking as a whole, and on big corporations taking over the studios. And being Mel Brooks, he really goes to town on the film, which, not surprisingly, he calls silent movie. And it is set very much, and it's done very much as the old classic silent movie, where there is absolutely no dialogue whatsoever other than one word, which is one of the standout jokes of the entire film. He gets a number of huge stars to appear in cameo roles, allegedly to get them to appear in his film Silent Movie. The most notable really being Burt Reynolds, who in the course of the film he very nearly kills with a steamroller. And he comes up with the idea of, wouldn't it be a good idea to cast one of the real stars of the original silent movie era in his silent movie film, which leads to the big joke of the film when he contacts Marcel Marceau, the very, very famous mime artist who never said a word on screen other than this one film. When he's asked, would you like to appear in this film called Silent Movie, and Marcel Marceau speaks no. It's the only word that's spoken in the entire film, and it's spoken by a mime artist. The film...
Wait. Say that last bit again, the word no.
Okay, it's the only word that is actually spoken in the entire film, and it's spoken by a mime artist. Now, as with the original silent movie classics, there are outrageous stunts in the line of Buster Keaton, which are lampooned, and as and when comedy sequences happen, they have ridiculous sound effects put on them. The most notable and the funniest of which is when Marty Feldman is being propelled backwards and forwards across a corridor from one elevator to another, and the sound effect that he put out is from a pinball machine. silent movie, again, was a huge success, and it's notable in that it's the first film that Mel Brooks himself appears in a starring role. He'd appeared in the other films that he'd done, but only as very sort of minor characters or as just as his voice. He'd never actually appeared as a star. In this one, he is the star. He went on from that, he contacted Alfred Hitchcock and had Alfred Hitchcock work with him on a script lampooning and satirising the Alfred Hitchcock films. That eventually became a film called High Anxiety, which is a bit of a misstep in that it basically lampoons films which have a lot of comedy in them anyway. Alfred Hitchcock was a very funny man, and even in the most suspenseful films that he made, there was always quite a bit of comedy included in them. And as such, High Anxiety isn't so much a satire and a skit on films, it's more of a homage to the Hitchcock films, and there are very few belly laughs in it, but it does produce a lot of chuckles with the nods to the Hitchcock films. Mel Brooks in the film, again, he's the star of the film. He plays a psychiatrist who is taking over a position at the home for the very nervous. Which when he gets there, he discovers that his predecessor had died under very mysterious circumstances, and he then goes off to find out what had actually happened to his predecessor. And the whole thing, every other scene basically has something from a Hitchcock film. And the best one of the lot is when Mel Brooks is in his hotel room and he calls for a newspaper. And the newspaper is delivered by the bellboy, who arrives when Mel Brooks is in the shower. And the bellboy immediately starts smacking the shower curtain with the newspaper as though he's stabbing him. And the last shot of the scene is you see the ink from the newspaper running down the drain in much the same way. It's basically a complete lift from the scene in Psycho where Janet Leigh is murdered. It's not as funny in any way, shape or form as the three previous films, but I don't really think it's intended to be. It's not really meant to produce real belly laughs. It is very much a homage to Hitchcock. Hitchcock himself loved the film. He receives a dedication on it, and he was so impressed with it, he actually sent a case of very expensive wine to Mel Brooks by way of appreciation for the tribute that was shown to him. Mel Brooks went on from strength to strength, and his next film really is his masterpiece. The film title, again, is a joke, and it was only ever intended to be a standalone film, but people did think that there was going to be a sequel, partly because of the title and partly because of the film and how the film ends. The film is called History of the World Part 1. And like Blazing Saddles, it's very much a scattergun approach in that it doesn't only have one target, it basically has a very broad range of things that it aims at. But unlike Blazing Saddles, it does it in a series of self-contained films within one film. Some of them are very short, some of them are quite lengthy. And every single one of them are completely irreverent and in the worst possible taste you can imagine. Again, particularly the segment from the Old Testament, which is the shortest segment of the lot, where Mel Brooks is playing Moses. And you see him on Mount Sinai being summoned by God or Jehovah. And he walks off behind this rock outcrop, and when he reappears, he's carrying 3 stone tablets, to which he proclaims to the people, here are the 15, and then he drops one of the tablets and it smashes, and he goes, oi, 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 oi. Here are the 10 commandments from God for which we must all obey. Not surprisingly, the film did receive a lot of complaints from a lot of Christian and Catholic organisations. It's not really surprising, really, but you know, this is Mel Brooks we're talking about, and you can't take what he does seriously. The film does actually get even worse and even more irreverent and in even more bad taste as it progresses. It moves on from the Old Testament to the Roman Empire, where Mel Brooks, again, Mel Brooks is the star of the film, and he actually plays 5 different characters in each 5 of the segments. In the Roman Empire segment, he plays a stand-up philosopher called Comicus, who is told by his agent at the start of the film that he's got a one-night gig at Caesar's palace. Caesar, of course, being the ruler of Rome, the Emperor Nero, who is married to the Empress Nympho, and they have a black slave called Josephus. And during the course of this one-night gig, Comicus completely forgets where he is, he forgets his audience and starts cracking jokes about the Emperor Nero himself and about how fat he is, and he ends up being thrown into the arena. And because Josephus, during the course of this, has managed to spill a gallon of wine all over the Emperor Nero, he's thrown into the arena as well, and the two of them have to fight to the death. They manage to escape with the help of the Empress Nympho into a cart which is pulled by a horse called Miracle. And you then get an almighty skit of the chariot race from Ben-Hur. They escape to Judea, where Comicus ends up working as a waiter in a restaurant, and he blunders into a room where the Last Supper is taking place. During the course of which Leonardo da Vinci arrived to paint the portrait of Jesus and the disciples, and because he can't see most of them, because all he can see is the back of their heads, he has them all sit next to each other so he can paint the portrait, and instructs Comicus to hold a silver plate above Jesus' head to act as a halo. By now I'm sure you're beginning to understand why the Catholic Church lodged a number of complaints about this film. But again, it actually gets even worse and more irreverent than that, because it moves on from that to the Spanish Inquisition, which is done as an entire tribute and skit on Busby Berkeley films, and the whole thing is a song and dance routine, which finishes with a Chinese water torture, which is done as an aquatic ballet with the torturers dressed as nuns. It then moves on to the French Revolution, where Mel Brooks is now playing King Louis XV. And he's also playing a character called Jacques, Jacques le Garçon de Pisse, which translates as the piss boy, and he basically carries around a bucket for people to go to the toilet in. But he also bears an uncanny resemblance to King Louis XV. And the story of this particular segment is that because the French Revolution is happening, the king has to be smuggled out of France. So Jacques is persuaded to take the king's place and impersonate the king. And of course he is then captured. He is sentenced to the guillotine. And as he is about to be guillotined, he's asked, "Do you have any last requests?" And he said, "Yes, I'd like some Novocaine." And when he's told that doesn't exist, there's no such thing, he said, "I'll wait, it'll exist in about another 200 years. Just as the blade is about to fall, one of the clergymen stood around the guillotine proclaims only a miracle will save him now. Whereupon a cart, pulled by a horse called Miracle, and steered by a black slave from the Roman Empire named Josephus arrives, and Jacques gets on the cart, and they disappear over the horizon, going past a mountain with the words "The End" carved into it. Whereupon you get the next joke in the film when you get a coming soon trailer, The History of the World Part 2, which promised such delight as Hitler on ice. And you see a clip of an ice skater doing a quite wonderful dance routine in a Gestapo uniform made up as Hitler. And also it promised another delight called Jews in Space, which was a skit on Star Wars and also a feature of the Muppet Show called Pigs in Space. The whole thing was a joke. There was never going to be a History of the World Part 2. It was just that's a joke onto the end of this film, but people actually thought it was real, and there was going to be a film called History of the World Part 2 with an ice skating Adolf Hitler and Jews in Space. What Mel Brooks did next was, funnily enough, a skit on Star Wars. And not just Star Wars, again, it was a very sort of broad approach of a number of different science fiction things. He goes for Star Trek, he goes for Star Wars, he goes for Alien, and he also goes for Planet of the Apes. And the main sort of portion of the thing is very much Star Wars, in that there is a massive battle station which is called Spaceball 1. And
Call Spaceball.
There is a massive battle station in the thing called Spaceball 1, which is under the command of a Colonel Sanders, who has as his henchman a character dressed head to foot in black who sounds like he's got a seriously bad asthma named Dark Helmet. Very, very funnily played by Rick Moranis. The Han Solo character in the film is called Lone Star, and as was fairly typical of Mel Brooks's films, he had a bit of trouble casting this role, and the first two people he went for, namely Tom Cruise and Tom Hanks, both flatly refused to have anything to do with the thing. They thought it would not work at all. So Mel Brooks decided that if he couldn't get a star to do it, he'd go for somebody who at that time was unknown as the star of his film, and he got Bill Pullman as Lone Star, who flies around in a spaceship called the Eagle 5 with his faithful half-man, half-dog sidekick named Barf, who are on the run from an intergalactic criminal named Pizza the Hutt. The film is as irreverent as you can imagine, and the only sort of surprise about the whole thing is that George Lucas, when he saw it, absolutely adored it, and he sent a message to Mel Brooks saying, please never make a film like that again because I laughed so much I nearly hurt something. The film didn't do that well in the box office, but it's actually one of the biggest sellers in VHS and DVD history. It's developed a major cult following since it was released in the cinemas, and it is very, very funny. Unlike Mel Brooks's next film, which was a comment on society as a whole, and it's called Life Stinks, and the least said about it the better, really. He basically plays a homeless person, and there's not even any chuckles in it. It's just not funny, but it is supposed to be a comedy. But it just fails on every single level. It's not the best thing of the lot. Unlike his next film, which the promotional posters of which proclaimed the legend had it coming. Robin Hood, Men in Tights, which on paper it doesn't actually sound that funny, but there are actually a number of very, very funny moments in it. And as with the History of the World Part 1, Mel Brooks shows he has a talent for ridiculous names. He casts Carrie Ells as Robin Hood, who, while he's away on the crusade, is captured and put in prison in Jerusalem. Whereupon he meets a fellow prisoner named A Sneeze, who begs Robin to help him find his son, who the last known whereabouts of which was he was in England. So the two of them manage to escape from prison, and Robin comes back to England, whereupon he finds a sneezer's son, who of course is named Achu. He goes on to go back to his estate, whereupon he discovers that the Sheriff of Rottingham has murdered all of his family and also all of his pets, and so he swears vengeance on him and goes off, recruits the Merry Men, including an incredibly stupid Little John and also Rabbi Tuck. And during the course of the film, it's not just a spoken film. There are like song and dance routines and everything in it. It's just completely off the wall. The end of the film actually pays tribute to one of his previous classics, when at the end of it, he's defeated the Sheriff of Rottingham. He's getting married to Maid Marian, and Achu has been named the new Sheriff of Rottingham. And one of the characters says, "But that means we'll have a black sheriff, it'll never work," whereupon Robin Hood looks straight into the camera and says, "Well, it did in Blazing Saddles." The film itself, again, it didn't do that well at the box office, but it did go on to do very, very well with VHS sales, and has gone on to do very, very well with DVD sales as well. And Mel Brooks is very proud of the fact that two of his films hold records for the number of VHS and DVD sales in the whole history of the sales of them. The only ironic thing in that is it's actually two films that didn't do that well at the box office. It's a great shame that the same cannot be said for Mel Brooks' last film, which was a skit on the original 1931 Dracula film starring Bela Lugosi, titled Dracula Dead and Loving It. And if ever a thing can be done wrong, it's this. And every single part of it is just an absolute disaster. Plot-wise, it follows the Bela Lugosi film very, very closely. And in that respect, it should be applauded. The sort of real disaster of it is in the casting of Dracula, when they cast Leslie Nielsen, who by this point had just abandoned all pretense of being a dramatic actor. He was actually a very, very fine dramatic actor, but from Airplane onward, when he developed and showed a serious talent for comedy, he never got to do drama again. As Dracula, it's very difficult to work out what he's trying to do, whether or not he's trying to take off Bela Lugosi, whether or not he's trying to take off Gary Oldman, or what. He's all over the place. But the same has to be said about the film. Tone-wise, it just makes no sense. Plot-wise, it makes no sense, and as a Mel Brooks film, it's a disaster because it just isn't funny at all, but equally, it isn't even dramatic. It just does not work at all, and it is a very, very sad ending, really, to the man's career. He has long since announced his retirement. He has occasionally come out of retirement when he makes a very fleeting appearance when The Producers was remade, when the musical version was done as a film, and rather than have his voice dubbed with the "Don't be stupid, be a smarty" line, he actually appears on screen delivering the line. And any time The Producers' stage play is produced, his voice is used for that line as well. There is very, very little doubt, despite the flops that he had and the type of films that he made, some of them are not going to hit the mark. They are going to not find their audience. But on the whole, Mel Brooks, his films are absolutely fantastic. The man was and is an absolute genius when it comes to filmmaking. He was not scared to take risks in how he made films, in his casting, and also in his writing. His sense of humour is off the wall, and he was brave enough to allow that to come through on screen, and to hell with the consequences of it. And more often than not, he was very, very successful in what he did. People eventually realised what he was doing and didn't take the films particularly seriously, which, with things like History of the World Part 1, is probably just as well. The world of cinema would be a very, very sorry place had these films not existed, and Mel Brooks rocks. Next time in the Classics Capsule, I promise it will be magnificent. This is Sean McKearnon signing off until next time. Thanks very much.